Yes, waiting for the rebel sultan. हालांकि he is absolutely, where is the rebel sultan, exactly what I'm asking, where is he, though he is definitely not a rebel. Yes, he's come, here he is. So here is the rebel sultan.
Hi,
Hi
Rana.
Ma, how are you?
I could just hear you, stating that I wasn't here, etc. Right here.
No, I said that we are waiting for you to join, and I said the people were asking where is the rebel sultan, and I said he's definitely not rebellious. That I'm sure of.
No, you started 5 minutes early, so yeah.
So that we can have some conversation. How are you? How's Pune?
Pune as well. All of Maharashtra is looking pretty bad, but so far, if you take all the usual precautions, it's not completely impossible, but still, it's a little scary that a city like Bombay, for example, is really struggling. I suppose things won't improve anytime soon, so we'll see.
So everybody has to stay at home. Until then, we can keep talking, learning,
Yeah.
doing whatever else we can, writing.
I know. I mean, it's so funny, right? Like in a space of 2 months, we've become so used to this whole digital thing. Whereas earlier, it was a rare thing. It was occasionally that you did online events, whereas now everything is online. It's just, yeah.
Now, I remember when the first time I was asked about Zoom, and everybody said, don't go to Zoom because it's a very unstable platform. And I refused to
Yeah, I've
do
heard
Zoom
that
in
as
the
well.
beginning. But now everybody is doing Zoom, so am I. So we
No,
are
I think
having,
Zoom has the advantage that you can link it to a bunch of other things. So you can link your Zoom to your Instagram, you can link it to YouTube, etc., and sort of stream on multiple platforms.
no, I just got an invitation for a wedding on Zoom. Uh, So I've done
That's
that. We
cool.
are having family conferences. I've even attended somebody's, funeral also on Zoom. So all these things, life is going on Zoom at the moment. So you're doing
Yeah,
whatever we would
yeah.
have done in person, we are doing on Zoom. So
I
what
know,
is,
but it must be a little tiresome for you to be stay cooped up at home, no? Because you tend to travel so much and move around so much. I was just
Ah,
thinking you're always sort of on the move. So
so I was supposed to be, I had my whole, March and April were lined up with travel because I thought May, June onwards, I wouldn't be able to travel in the summer months. So I
yeah.
fell down in February and I hurt my knee and tore a ligament. So these three
Are you
months have been, I'm okay now. So these 3 months have
okay?
given me that rest, which I
Uh,
probably would
uh,
not
uh.
have taken had it not been
Otherwise,
for this. I would have continued
yeah.
limping through and gone wherever I had to go. So that way it's been good, and I've been just doing a lot of other things to stay busy.
Hmm.
So I think we've
Oh
got
wow, I can see lots of
one.
like comments, etc. This is almost distracting to see all these comments at the bottom of the thing.
I think we're going to break the internet today because I have never had this kind of audience before, Manu, and this is your fan club, I'm sure. So
Thank
before
you.
we start, let
Well, I hope
me
we, yeah.
show you this book. This is the book by Manu, which we'll be talking about. And I think I was also one of the first to interview you on this book for Juggernaut.
Yes, it was a video interview. I
Yes, video
remember.
interview.
Yeah,
So
that was the first time we met.
that was the first time we met and the first time we talked about it. And I was so impressed
Yeah,
by you and the way you conduct yourself and the way you answer. So I'll go straight into the first question, I think,
sure,
because you've got a lot of people here. Uh,
sure.
you say in your book, you start by saying that the story of the Deccan has its root deep in Indian history. And in the next
Hmm.
paragraph, you say, to know India, then we must know the Deccan. Yet, just as North India has become all about the Mughals, Deccan has become all about Shivaji.
Yeah.
You fill in the gaps. So, can you just tell us how you or why you chose to do that, and how important is the Deccan for the pre-Shivaji Deccan for the rest of India,
Yeah.
the rest of Indian history?
Well, to begin with, much of the Deccan occupies most of the peninsula. Like the northern half of the South Indian peninsula is all the Deccan. That's broadly the area that we call the Deccan. And anything that has access to the sea has access to a larger world. It's not landlocked. It's always in contact with the rest of the world. and that this is, some of the earliest Muslim settlements in the country, long before they came with armies in the north from the Sindh. They actually landed up on the coasts, on the west coast of India, which was in the Deccan, Kerala, the Deccan, Konkan coast, etc. So in that sense, there's obviously importance. The other thing is, there's always been this tendency in northern empires to want to sort of move south and dominate the peninsula, which meant that there was something there of value. Dominating the peninsula meant that there was a reason for these northern empires to go there. And I think, I grew up here. I grew up in Maharashtra. So, Deccan history was always part of our curriculum when we studied our school history books. But the difference was that, as you said, it was dominated by the Marathas, and that too not the entire Maratha period. It was dominated usually by the starting phase, which is Shivaji, Chhatrapati Shivaji starting. Then it goes to a little bit to the Peshwa period, and that's it. So you don't really study the later Marathas, the Scindias, the Holkars, the people who conquered the north and Bengal and all of those parts. Nor do you study what came before Shivaji. Because, even the Marathas, as I often say, they didn't just spring out of nowhere. There was a stage that had already been created, a foundation had already been created. And Deccan history was initially, for me, the awareness that the Maratha identity, even as a caste identity, it comes first in service of the Sultanates of the Deccan. It's when the local, agricultural castes, peasantry, when they're the ones the people in the villages who cooperate with the Sultanate officials. The Sultanate is limited to the urban areas. The Muslim, elites are in the urban areas. How do they dominate the countryside? They have these Hindu groups, as it were. These terms are not exactly, suited for that period. But let's just use them now. They're the ones who help them expand their power. In the process, the local population also developed a Hindu aristocracy, which is what we now call the Marathas, as a caste community. So even that caste identity of a very powerful Hindu group to this day comes from their links with that Sultanate era. And the sultans appear in a lot of local literature, whether it's Eknath's period, later Bhakti poetry, etc. The Deccan is always there. It's just that because Shivaji and then the Maratha period has become politically significant. It's become politically significant even now. That is why you tend to focus on that and then forget everybody who came before that, which is sad. And it's not, that period doesn't deserve it. It's actually such an exciting period that, I wish more people would read up and learn about it.
So another book has just come out, Srinivas Reddy's Raya, which again is a wonderful book. And when I was reading it, I just kept on thinking about your book. And that how now more and more people are going to probably come forward and write about the Deccan. Now, when we are writing...
Yeah, because, there are so many stories to be told, and, there's so much to be excavated. My book really, in many ways, is only meant to be an introduction. It's just to whet the appetite. It's just to tell people that, look, there are stories here, and maybe you should invest your time and energy to look for more. And, there are so many others who are slowly picking up, different aspects of it. Pushkar Sohoni, for example, he teaches here in Pune. He's an expert on the Nizam Shahi Sultanate of Ahmednagar, especially the architecture. And it's remarkable because the architecture tells you so much. There's, if you go to the tombs, not the tombs really, sorry, the samadhis of Shivaji's grandfather, Maloji, which is his paternal grandfather, that's near Ellora. And in another region near Daulatabad, there's this, where the old Yadava capital was, there's this memorial to his maternal grandfather, the Jadhavs of Devagiri, as they're called. Both these structures are built in that entirely Islamicate Persianate style. In fact, the controversial scholar James Lane, in one of his writings, actually refers to the Ellora buildings as tombs. They're not tombs. There's no tomb inside. It's just considered a samadhi. That's the site where these men were cremated. But the structure is completely Islamicate in its design, which again tells you so much about this constant intermingling. And even just that one aspect of the architecture of the Deccan can sort of open your eyes to the complexities of the subject that we call history, and which, people like you and I are trying to at least present in that mold and that perspective.
So when you are writing history, whether it is the Deccan or whether it is North India or whichever part of history you're writing, now this question is specifically, of course, for the Deccan. What kind of research did you do? What were your sources? And what are the traps that we should avoid falling into when we are writing history? Well, that's such a controversial period.
Yeah, no, the sources are always interesting the further back you go in time, right? Because if you, for example, most of my work it pertains to that British era colonial period. there's a wealth of material because the British ruled this country through paper, files, bureaucracy, writing. They left diaries, reports, census reports, all kinds of things. The further back you go, not only are you dealing with a wholly different set of languages, the material starts becoming different, and negotiating that material starts becoming slightly, let's say, you have to be shrewder in the way you read it. For example, a lot of inscriptional evidence is obviously full of bombast. It's obviously full of a lot of royal, flaunting of the ego. It's got a grain of truth in it. That desire of a king to flaunt his ego has historical value. But not everything written in an inscription may have historical value. So you need a certain amount of academic awareness to be able to negotiate that, to be able to understand that subtle difference, and to be able to understand, separate the wheat from the chaff, that kind of a thing. So too, languages. There are all these Persian accounts that are left. Whether it's, of course, Ferishta is the main figure who's written a great deal about the Deccan. He was patronized by a Sultan of Bijapur. That's where he did his big history. So you have Persian accounts like that. You have Sanskrit poetry. For example, Shivaji's court poet Shiva Bharata, which was written in the 1670s. That has a lot of history. It mentions Malik Ambar. It mentions the prominent Maratha families of the Deccan. It mentions the prominent Muslim nobles of Bijapur and the Nizam Shahi Sultanate in that period. So you get that out of a Sanskrit poem. It's a praise poem. It's actually a panegyric. It's like this, it's praising Shivaji, flattering him as Vishnu's incarnation on earth, etc. So you can't really claim this is a historical work as we understand it today. But there is historical value in it. When what Shivaji is trying to communicate is something of value. He's become Chhatrapati by now. And therefore, that poem is trying to, on the one hand, legitimize his royal status. On the other hand, present his own kingly vision. But in that, there's all these actual historical details of names and families and, who was on whose side and things like that. You also have art. There's if you open, for example, something like the manuscript of the Nujum al-Ulum, which was made in the late 16th century by Ibrahim Adil Shah's uncle. It's full of these amazing images. It's full of these amazing illustrations in it, and the illustrations have a life of their own. To begin with, the women, for example, they're wearing saris. It's all in a Persianate, Arabic, mix language thing. There's some Sanskrit influence also. But the way their physiques have been constructed is derived out of some South Indian temple sculptures. That's the kind of thing that's brought. The jewelry that these Islamic figures are wearing is South Indian temple style. You find, for example, Venus, Zura, is not presented in the usual Islamic mold. It's presented like a Hindu deity with multiple arms, etc. Because they've sort of married these two styles and given that a visual record, an image, as a point of reference, in the Nujum. So, there's visual archives like that. Then, of course, the most important thing is travel, to go and see as many of these places as possible yourself, because that makes all the difference. I decided to write this book when I was in Golconda in 2016. I had gone there for the first time. And when I was there, I really thought, my God, these structures, these tombs, the Golconda fort, this is not the Mughals, this is not the Marathas, this is not any of the old familiar dynasties we hear about. It's not the Nizams of Hyderabad. It's basically these people, from a different generation, from a different time, with so much intermixture of culture and blood and all that. They're the ones who made this. And, someone needs to try and resurrect their stories. So sources vary from personal experience, monuments, artwork, your Persian sources, your Sanskrit sources, inscriptional evidence, and so on. And in many respects, the one thing that I try to do is sort of bridge this academic world with our world of trying to write for a larger audience. Because in pockets of academia, different aspects of this have been studied. It's just that nobody's tried to bring it all together and do like a big picture narrative. And I think that for me is always very interesting, because we are living in times when history is becoming increasingly contested, increasingly part of our everyday life. It's not like this is any more about political parties and their ideologies alone. People on a daily basis are starting to discuss history, and this whataboutery on Twitter and things like that. So big picture history does matter now. And I think, it's worth making that effort, doing as best as you can by marrying the academic with the sources and with your own experience.
Exactly. I think there's one question before I ask mine. I'll ask Seema is asking, African military slaves were an integral part of Deccan history, but very little is written about them. Could you comment on this, please?
Yeah, in fact, I should have mentioned that when we're talking about sources and the diversity, which is that, when we say military slaves, the word slave can sometimes be a misnomer. We often think of slaves in terms of, the American slavery system where it's a menial service, etc. This is not that. These slaves were military men. They were brought in as soldiers, usually because the sultans or the kings in power, and this was true of Vijayanagar also. If you read Srinivas's book, he talks about a few African, African presence in the Vijayanagar court as well. The reason kings often did this was, power was this very fickle substance in those days. No matter how much you try to legitimize it, how much poetry you write around yourself, how many inscriptions you put, it can very easily be, your power can very easily be demolished by sheer force of arms. In that context, you need loyal military forces supporting you, backing your throne. And successively, these sultans would find that, your nobles can conspire against you, your family members can conspire against you. We see that in Vijayanagar, for example. We see that in the Bahmani court, for example. But if you have a crop of soldiers whose only loyalty is to you, then that makes all the difference. To give a contemporary reference, in Game of Thrones, there's this Khaleesi, Daenerys Targaryen, and she has these people, these horsemen that she gets on her side, and they're extremely loyal to her. They're foreigners. They don't belong to the place where she comes from. They come from outside, but because she is their only link to that place, they remain loyal to it. It's a little bit like that, which is that these gentlemen are brought in. They're separated from their original families in Africa. They have no cultural links in India. They have no sense of community in India as such. They don't bring their women generally with them because they've been enslaved when they were kids. So their only sense of loyalty is to their patron. Their only person who they will constantly sort of support is the patron, because the patron protects them. That's how the Africans first came here. But you see, that at different times, different communities start coming into their own. So first, the Dakhni Muslims, they were the dominant set. Then you have this huge influx of immigrants from Shia Iran, from Safavid Iran. They become the next power elite of sorts, and there's this huge clash between the Dakhnis and the Iranians, the Afakis as they're called. Then you have at the same time the rise of the Marathas on the one side, and the Africans are also slowly starting to form their own sense of community. So if there's one African warlord who becomes very powerful, he will get his child married to a corresponding African warlord's daughter or son in another Deccan Sultanate. So there's a lot of movement of the elites within the kingdoms. There are no hard and fast borders. The elite can literally get up from one court and go to the other court and just sort of plonk themselves there. You have a case like that in Vijayanagar, where a bunch of about 3,000 Afakis or Iranian origin Muslims, they are dismissed by the Sultan. They lift themselves lock, stock and barrel and go off to Vijayanagar, and Vijayanagar takes them into its service. So there's that kind of movement. And so at different times, these communities come in. Just before, as I said, Dakhnis first, then you have this phase where the Westerners or the Iranians are dominant. Then you have a phase where an African, under Malik Ambar, the famous Malik Ambar in the early 17th century, the Africans are really, ruling the game. He's the one really who controls the fate of the Deccan, keeps the Mughals at bay for 25 years. But then when he dies, that last group that so far hasn't fully tasted power, which is the Marathas, they come into their own, and under Shivaji, they actually claim even kingly power. The sultanates are completely discarded, and they start something new of their own. So you can almost see a sequence like this of different players, and the Africans were very much one of the main players in the Deccan in that way.
And Malik Ambar, of course, everybody knows about that famous painting of Jahangir trying to shoot at Malik Ambar, and one of our favorite, I think yours and mine both, favorite character from the Deccan. There's a question here, Manu. Are there any dangers in writing about history? Meaning, can you, despite all care, misread facts and thus misrepresent them? How do you prevent this from happening?
So, I mean, the one thing about history is that, your facts always evolve. I won't say facts change, because facts are factual. But your perspectives evolve based on more evidence. We always play with the amount of evidence we have. So to begin with, anybody working with history has to have a basic humility that what you write is never the last word. Something what you and I are working on now, Radha, 25 years from now, it may be completely outdated because new technologies are coming into play. Especially when you're talking about ancient history, genetic studies are coming into play. It's no longer, you can't sort of stamp something and say that this is it. This is true history. So there's that basic issue in it. The other thing is, yes, sometimes we have our own filters. Sometimes we have our own biases that are not necessarily very obvious. It may just be subliminal. It might just be in our head. We may not even know we have it, but it certainly does impact our writing. The difference, however, is that there are propagandists. There's one nice quote. The K.N. Panikkar, the historian, someone asked him whether he liked my book or something, and a professor told me this later. He asked him whether he liked my books and so on, and Dr. Panikkar said yes, and he said, and someone said, what do you think about popular history? He said, popular history is good. What is not good is populist history. And that's the difference, right? If you're a propagandist who picks and chooses, bits and pieces of history to construct or to legitimize something or to justify something, then that's slightly different terrain. But if you go in with as much objectivity as possible, consciously keeping our mind open, saying, I'm going to go in, be led by the evidence as far as possible, and I will acknowledge my bias. I will acknowledge my own flaws and weaknesses. Then you have something close to what you can call the truth. Something that resembles the truth, but it may not be the whole truth, because that is always going to evolve. We can't really, categorically say that this is it. I think that basic humility is key when you're doing history of any kind.
In fact, when we are re-editing, like I remember this book of mine, it came out in 2015. When the new edition came out, I edited quite a lot of things, because by then I had come to know so much. Just in a couple of years, you come to know, new sources come to you, and you find out about other things. I'm talking of basically monuments. Some monuments which I thought were lost have been discovered. So we keep updating ourselves, and we try to update it as soon as, the next. And as I remember, I had made one mistake in one of my books, and I was very upset about it. And one of my friends, who's a professor of history, was my class fellow, and he said, only God's work is perfect. So it's okay, you made a mistake.
Everybody's work is, In fact, the funny thing is, there was I won't take any names, but a very senior historian had a very senior, very distinguished historian had a newspaper interview that I remember reading. And there was this egregious error in one of the answers, and I kept Googling again and again to make sure I hadn't got it wrong, just to because I was so stunned that he would have such a slip of tongue. But it happens. It's not to judge anyone; that it just happens. And especially when you're dealing with so much material, my book, for example, is a 300-page book, but the amount of material you're dealing with is immense. It's about 20 times the size of the book. So sometimes in the process of it, there are human errors. There are errors, where you've either misread something, or while you were typing, you've sort of put the wrong date, for example. The 6 becomes a 7 because your finger lands on the wrong key on the keyboard. There's all kinds of issues like that as well, which can mar your work.
Those the same issues of, like 260. I get confused many times between 0 and 9 and 1 and 2. So when I'm writing my dates, I have to be very careful, because, when I'm writing if I'm using both my hands, those are mistakes I made, and we keep correcting them, acknowledging them, and evolving, as you said. So of course, that part is always there. So to come back,
and that willingness to correct, it's important.
And accept and move on. So we come back to, when I was in school, I used to find the Bahmani and the rivalry between the Bahmani and the Vijayanagar kingdom very fascinating. And Hassan Gangu and all these names, when I think those were the times when we had no idea where Deccan was. Living in Lucknow in the 60s and the early 70s, I had no idea that I would ever even visit the Deccan, or leave alone go and live there. So for us, it used to be, very fascinating. So can you just tell us a little bit about the establishment of the Vijayanagar and the Bahmani kingdoms, the rivalry between them? And one more question I'll add, so that you can just continue on that. The rivalry wasn't only between the Vijayanagar and the Bahmani. Raya also had a rivalry with Udaygiri, which was in Odisha. So can you just talk about this triangular rivalry and how it impacted the history?
It was, to begin with, the context is important, right? Because both these kingdoms emerged with the space of 1 year. They're officially founded with a gap of just 1 year. The Bahmanis first in 1347, I think, and the Vijayanagar one, I think, just after that. Or I may have got the exact dates wrong, but just around it. So both these kingdoms are founded almost at the same time. One dominates the northern half of the peninsula, the other's going to dominate the southern half of the peninsula. Both these kingdoms are coming out of the ashes of the previous kingdoms that were there. all opportunity of a military type is born out of chaos. That's just how it is. So you have the Delhi Sultans invading the south, Malik Kafur, etc. They go all the way into Tamil Nadu, into Madurai, places like that. In Madurai, for example, there was a sultanate for a short-lived period. One of the Madurai Sultan's daughters was married to the famous traveler Ibn Battuta, for example. Little details like that. So, but then it's a time of flux. There's a lot of change happening. And in that, there are two enterprising groups of people who establish two kingdoms. In the case of Vijayanagar, it's usually, textbooks say two brothers, but it's actually five brothers, the sons of Sangama. These five brothers sort of spread out and, collect or hoover up pieces that are falling here and there in the southern part of the peninsula. Then in the northern half of the Deccan, you have the sultans, which is the Bahmanid sultans, who emerged entirely almost out of a lottery system, which is that, all these nobles that Delhi sent down. It's a little bit like, Europeans colonizing America and then America saying that, look, we want to be independent, even though they have a lot of cultural links. Same here, they've come to the Deccan, they've realized that Delhi can't exercise much control on them. Why are we paying tribute to Delhi? We'll make this our own. So they come together, they first elect an older man as Sultan, but he decides that he's not good enough. So he makes way for a younger man who had proved himself on the field, and he's the first of the Bahmani Sultans. As I said, same time as Vijayanagar. So from the beginning, these are two military states. They're oriented, they're completely fresh. So they're never going to give up their military strength very easily. They have no established institutions, established structures. So they have very strong armies. They have very powerful military establishments with them. And they emerge in that way as two military states in the region. The rivalry is natural. It's often based on the basis of rivers, really, in the Deccan. And the difference of geography. In fact, that's another thing we don't study enough, which is the impact of geography on the flow of history. Because often a lot of shapes that societies take, kingdoms take, is because of the geography of that region. So that impacts them as well. And there's this constant tussle because both of them they want to both dominate the trade, especially the foreign trade with horses, for example, because horses are the basis for your cavalry armies, for your cavalrymen, which means that you need to get the best horses and your rival should not get it. They covered territory because often the most fertile things is naturally around these rivers that you treat as your boundaries, and therefore you want to go out and dominate those areas. There are gold mines, diamond mines, there's feuds about all that. And there is, of course, which later gets politicized, this idea of religious self-identity. Now, neither of these kingdoms viewed themselves as some kind of blocks in religious terms, which was that we are utterly Hindu and therefore these are our enemies, or we are Muslims and therefore these are our enemies. Naturally, one being an Islamic sultanate or an Islamic dynasty, they sort of developed their personality in Islamic terms, in Persianate terms, in contact with the Islamic world. Whereas the Vijayanagar emperors, because they came from India itself, they were, sort of South Indian men who established the thing, they built up. They also wanted to leave behind their sort of provincial roots. They wanted to highlight their newfound kingly status. So they fell back on Sanskrit. Sanskrit, before the Persianate age, as Richard shows, the last 1,000 years were a Persianate phase. Before that, there was a phase when Sanskrit was a trans-regional, trans-cultural language. They sort of pumped that out to sort of build their self-identity. So naturally, both kingdoms had these self-images that were divergent and sometimes could take use religious vocabulary. But they were equally using each other's cultures as well. In the Bahmani Empire, it was Vijayanagar's coins that were currency. In Vijayanagar, they used to move around wearing Persian fashions because that was what they were exposed to. Vijayanagar, famously in 1347 itself, the sultans start calling themselves Hindu Raya Suratrana, sultans among Hindu kings, because they're already engaging with the Persianate world. The Bahmani sultans, when one of them marries a Vijayanagar princess, in the dowry, he wants not just gold, not just pearls and riches, but also 2,000 cultural professionals, architects, musicians, dancers, painters, people like that. They come in and they influence Bahmani architecture. There's a lot of exchange happening. And as I said, the elite manages to move around a lot between these two kingdoms as well. So although they are enemies, they're also not going at each other's throats because they're defenders of their faith. Faith is usually carted in when each has some justification it's looking for some very political deed. Yes, faith also defined their kingly self-image, but politics then as today was not really only about religion. Just as today politicians use religion to justify political goals, these people did the same thing. So these were two kingdoms with their specific geographies, with their specific rivalries in a similar cultural domain. and they were born at the same time, so they were natural rivals. And in both kingdoms, if you look finally, the collapse did not happen because one triumphed over the other. The collapse happened because their own people destroyed whatever dynasty was there before. For the Bahmanis, it was their own governors. Same with the Mughals. Right? Once your power starts declining, your governors start flexing their muscles and they set up independent sultanates. So the Bahmanis wither their own governors, the Adil Shah in Bijapur, Nizam Shah in Ahmednagar, Qutub Shah in Golconda, and two more. There are 5 of these sultanates that come. Same with Vijayanagar. Vijayanagar is defeated by the sultans in 1565, but the empire did not die. The empire continued for another 70 years. In that period, it was Vijayanagar's own Nayakas in Tanjavur, in Madurai, in Jinji, and the Mysore royal family. They're the ones who leached away power from the center. And the last Vijayanagar emperor was a king without a kingdom because his own governors had taken over. So in both kingdoms, they emerge at the same time, same patterns seem to appear, and their decline is also very similar because of internal differences and a shift in the balance of power.
That's, so beautifully brought out. And the rivalry between Vijayanagar and Udaygiri.
Of course, we don't usually cover enough because we always tend to view Vijayanagar and the sultans as Hindu versus Muslim, the clash of two cultures, the clash of two civilizations, etc. We forget that actually Vijayanagar's equally, sort of hated enemy was the Gajapati in Orissa. It was a lifelong obsession for different Hindu sultans in Vijayanagar to actually put these Orissa Gajapatis in their place. Krishnadevaraya, in fact, famously, we often think that temple demolitions, etc., were purely an iconoclastic thing that sultans did. Hindu kings did not destroy temples, but they often stole idols. They often took idols from rival kings and brought it to their kingdoms. So in the case of Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagar, there was one idol he brought from Bijapur kingdom, which was the famous one at Pandharpur. That was actually brought to Vijayanagar. Later, a Brahmin went back and negotiated and took the idol back. That's why you find that one is returned. In the case of Orissa, his hatred for Orissa was so much that he took the idol of, I think, Krishna from Udaygiri and never returned it. He just took it, planted it in Vijayanagar. For him, it was a sign of conquest. Because the Gajapati king, you are the king. You are supposed to protect this temple. You are supposed to protect your Udaygiri Krishna and be his servant, etc. But you failed. And therefore, your God is now with me. He was trying to make that kind of a point. Srinivas Reddy makes us point very wonderfully in his book, in his new book Raya, where he talks about how, on a personal level, for Krishnadevaraya, it wasn't the sultans who were that much of a problem. It was Gajapati in Orissa, because the Gajapati used to snootily say that he was an upper caste Kshatriya, whereas Vijayanagar's Krishnadevaraya was a Dasiputra, the son of a Shudra maid, and therefore never his equal. Even when the Gajapati was defeated, the Gajapati's nose was still in the air because he could claim a higher pedigree and a better bloodline than Krishnadevaraya. So in that context, it's caste that was really the tension between those two kingdoms. Whereas here it may have been worldview, it may have been different religious elements, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, it was politics on both sides.
Yes.
And there's this wonderful Telugu work called the Raya Vachakamu, in which you see this, where it's written in the early 17th century, but it pretends that it's covering the period of Krishnadevaraya in an earlier century. But what's interesting is it completely vilifies the Deccan sultans in a very religious sense. Like they are, mlechas, they destroy cows, they kill Brahmins, they're so violent, this and that. But the thing is, it's again not a blanket statement about all Muslims, for example. It basically says that these sultans are bad, but the Mughal emperor in Delhi is very good because, he is also their enemy, just like Vijayanagar is their enemy. So my enemy's enemy is my friend. So the Mughal emperor is flattered as blessed by Kashi Vishwanath, whereas the Gajapati in Orissa is blessed by Jagannath, and Vijayanagar, of course, has its own deity, and these are considered the 3 lion thrones of India. So even in the Raya Vachakamu, you're equating Mughal as good because I like you that the Mughals hate the Deccan Sultans, but the Deccan Sultans you use in this very, very religious vocabulary, you sort of vilify them and make them look like complete bigots because it serves your political purpose at that time. So, it's interesting the overlaps between all this. Again, there are some who will say religion was absolutely not a factor. We shouldn't go to that extreme either, because clearly religion existence of that sense of us and them does appear between kings. It's not a communal sense. The best example of this is Shivaji himself. when he becomes Chhatrapati, when he writes the Shiva Bharata, as I said, he claims to be, Vishnu's, he doesn't write it, his court poet writes it. He's presented as Vishnu's avatar on earth to destroy and remove the Muslim rule from the Deccan. But that doesn't change the fact that his own father and uncle, on the ground in a syncretic system, their grandparents had named them after a Sufi saint called Shah Sharif, a Muslim. Because in that generation, when it was still on the ground, relationships were very syncretic. But when you're a king, kings have an incentive in using religious identity because for them it's how they legitimize their power. It's them that's how they sort of sculpt their self-image. So it's both. It's not an either or. It's always an and between these factors. That's why in the dynamics you find between Vijayanagar and Gajapati, it's caste feuds between the sultans and this thing. They can claim it's some kind of great religious vendetta, but frankly, it's just power and politics then as today.
There's one question. Ram Raya raised mosques when he invaded the Nizam-Shahi territory, proving that destruction of religious places was more of a power symbol. Can you throw some light on that?
Yeah, because the thing is, what were the temples and mosques that were usually destroyed or usually attacked? They were the ones that had significance for the dynasty that was your current enemy. So I'll give you an example, not from the Deccan, for now, in Kerala, for example. Tipu Sultan is often, he's considered, and he did have a very brutal campaign in Malabar when he invaded Malabar. And there were a lot of temples that were attacked and looted, etc., etc. But again, it was not all temples. It was temples of those Rajas who either ran away and did not bend the knee to him. It was those Rajas who disappeared into the forest and were still fighting him. Their key temples that were linked to their families, your Kula Devata, whatever, those he would attack. I met Jaya Jetli recently, and Jaya Jetli is the granddaughter of the last Raja of Kolangod, which is also in Palakkad in North Kerala. They, in their family temple, have a plinth or a platform or something that was actually donated by the same Tipu Sultan to their family, because their ancestor went and surrendered to Tipu Sultan. So there was no question of destroying that temple. It was always the temple of the enemy king that was to be destroyed. Now, again, there was this interesting article I read once recently that about a month or two ago, which talked about how we should also be careful about this argument of selective demolition, because it's a little bit like saying that, an army came in and they've destroyed all the big churches of Rome and they've left all the village churches to survive. You can't really draw that conclusion. But in India, it's a slightly different thing. As I said, Hindu kings could also take deities. It happened in Kerala also. There are several examples of one Hindu king stealing the gods of another Hindu king. We repeatedly find that even big important temples were not randomly attacked. They were attacked only at a time when the king who was connected to those temples was being refractory, or had issued a challenge to the enemy, and the enemy had to make some kind of a political point. I think Supriya Gandhi, in her book on Dara Shikoh, talks about an order I think Shah Jahan gave. I'm not entirely sure. I'm using this entirely out of memory, but an order Shah Jahan gave to destroy all the temples under construction, I think in Banaras at some point, and there were some 70 temples that were stopped, or they were pulled down at that time. But the thing is, the very fact that 70 or 75 temples were being constructed shows that this was not a normal thing. This was not a routine thing. Those 75 temples were happening not as acts of rebellion at that time. They were happening because normally it wasn't an issue. But Shah Jahan at that particular point wanted to make a statement, which is why he ordered those particular demolitions. So even when you say 75 temples are demolished, the fact is, why were those 75 temples being built in the first place? You had the freedom to build it. So the demolition is one exceptional act in that particular context. And therefore, that context is very important when you study what mosque was destroyed by the Vijayanagar emperor, or what temple the sultans would attack when they came in. Again, there's a strange irony that when the Vijayanagar Hampi, the proper capital, fell in 1565, they looted the city, they demolished a lot of buildings, but somehow the temple seemed to have survived. The Vittala temple has survived. There's this huge Shivalingam there that survived, and nobody seems to have answered how it is that when the city was sacked, somehow these temples have managed to survive, and they're still there to this day. So there are no easy answers to this.
Because there's such beautiful temples.
I know the true tragedy is, just thinking of how many monuments we've lost, because there must have, all of these temples were built with such, splendor and glory, and they were meant to be these architectural, structures of great, they were exemplary of the local system and style. So it would have been amazing to have had those even now. And it's a pity that kings felt like they had to pull it down every now and then. But, such is. And our job is not to judge that period. Our job is to understand it and sort of move on from there.
And I would suggest that those who are asking these questions should read Richard Eaton's India in the Persianate Age. It goes a long way in helping you understand that period. There's one question from Madhurya. In your book, The Courtesan, the Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin, how did you manage to connect the short stories? It's so unique and holds the reader's attention throughout. That's true.
Well, the idea was not to link it through in a very solid way. I basically broadly divided it into two periods: before the Raj, then the Raj era stories, and finally a closing essay which is contemporary to our own time. So it sort of covers a large span from the 12th century to the 20th century. But the other thing is there are a few broad common thematic or research interests. It's usually gender, it's usually caste, and it's usually human eccentricity, and that human eccentricity is always very interesting to me, because the one thing I find about history, the more you read about it, is you discover that all these kings and queens, all these historical figures, poets, saints, they were also very human at the core. And you see that sometimes in their own writings. The frankness in Jahangir's diary, for example, where he talks about little details about things that happened, a very vivid picture of that emperor's mind comes. You can almost visualize him as a human being. And I think for me, that's why these were the three broad trends, other than the academic ideas of caste and gender. The idea of sort of celebrating human eccentricity and human behavior was very important to me, because I think it makes history more relatable. When you start realizing that historical figures don't live on a different planet, they never lived on a different planet. Their context may have been different, but their core human instincts and impulses were the same. You start connecting to them better. It's what I call the gossip magazine logic. Why do gossip magazines survive? Because human beings have an interest in other human beings' stories. They're always interested in other human beings and other people. So if you start seeing history not as a sequence of dates, not as a collection of battles, not as an abstract universe of 5 empires, but you trace history through the people who made history, you start taking a very similar interest in their lives and their times, because you're looking at it from a human perspective. And that, I think, always works for readers.
There's a very interesting question. Could you enlighten us about the role of Kerala rulers during Bahmani Sultanate time and why it remained a separate entity?
So Kerala, again, this is one of those cases where geography plays a big role, which is that Kerala sort of cut off on the one side by the Western Ghats, and there's only a very few passes into Kerala. The southern tip of Kerala had greater exposure to Tamil Nadu, but also limited. But usually, even when Vijayanagar was extremely powerful, Vijayanagar, I never actually invaded Kerala, because it had no reason really to come in. Kerala was sort of its own zone. And because it was a trading society on the seashore, as it were, it was always culturally in contact with Arabia. So Kerala's contacts were more overseas with Mecca, with Arabia, etc., rather than with North India. That was just an attribute of geography. And that's why in Kerala also, there were never any great kingdoms till the 18th century. They were all these patchwork kingdoms. Even when a king defeated another king, Kerala has 44 rivers, sort of crisscrossing it. It's very difficult, say, in the rainy season to cross these and retain physical control over large chunks of territory. So kings would defeat another king. A king would defeat another king, make him his vassal, tell him, you must send me a flag of tributes and some token gifts, and that was enough. There was no empire building kind of style in Kerala. Still, they were not completely cut off from what was happening in the Deccan Sultanates, because you find that once the Portuguese come in, the Portuguese disrupt trade in the Arabian Sea. And that basically means that all these kingdoms on the west coast that have trading relations with Arabia, all of them are suddenly facing the brunt. They're paying the price for Portuguese adventurism. So suddenly you find the Zamorin of Calicut has an alliance with the Sultan of Bijapur, the King of Egypt. All of them come together and they have an alliance. It doesn't lead anywhere, but it's interesting that they were able to create such connections. And you also find that there was this text that was written in the Portuguese period in Calicut, but it's dedicated to the Adil Shah of Bijapur. It's quite interesting because the Adil Shah at that time was really fighting it out against the Portuguese. So for doing that, this text that was written in Malabar actually praised the Adil Shah in Bijapur. So there were contacts, but these were again economic contacts through trade, through a common interest in maintaining that Arab-dominated trade economy rather than a territorial interest. But if you read, again, Sanskrit poetry, you won't find this, because in Sanskrit poetry, you often find kings, when they exaggerate, they often, Sultan Balban in Delhi, for example, there's a Sanskrit inscription which says how when he went out with his armies, the Karnataka people shook and the Keralas ran into their caves and things like that. Frankly, the Keralas had no idea who the hell he was. It was just that when you sort of flaunt your kingly identity, you hear and you pick up everything that Sanskrit poetry gives you historically about different parts of the country and throw it in, pretending that you dominate all these people. There's this king of Tanjavur at one point where they were actually paying tribute to the Mughals from 1691. But in the early 18th century, you find this fascinating text which claims that they had conquered all of India between Banaras and Tanjavur. So it's a quite interesting claim to make in a literary text, when in reality, you actually don't have much of a contact other than tributary relationships with the northern power.
Another very interesting question. What was the role of women in these Deccan empires? Can we say that they were that was a more egalitarian society?
No, I wouldn't use terms like this and sort of retrospectively apply them to something that happened in the 17th century, 16th century, and 15th century. But women did play a very important role. The most glamorous female figure in the Deccan is Chand Bibi, who's also called Chand Sultan. She was at the end of the 1590s, in the mid 1590s, she was the one who was really fighting it out against the Mughals, and sort of when they besieged Ahmednagar, she was in the fort leading the charge. She again was not murdered by the enemy. The enemy actually gave her a lot of praise because she was so brave and valiant. It was her own courtiers who murdered her because they had issues with women dominating. Her mother was similar. Her mother, Kunza Humayun, she was a similar figure. For 6 years, she ruled when her husband died and her son was a minor. And in that period, she made herself such a powerful force that finally the courtiers had to sort of orchestrate a coup and get her son to get rid of her. And not only did he get rid of her in a physical sense by locking her up and putting her in house arrest, he also actually wiped her out of these miniature paintings. There are these miniature paintings where Kunza Humayun appears with her husband. And, I find it so hilarious that this man was so insecure that he had to convert his mother into a giant blob of paint because he didn't want her portrait to survive even in these miniatures. So you have these pictures where the Sultan is sort of sitting like that with a blob next to him rather than a female presence. There's another lady which was in Bijapur, and I don't actually talk about her in the book, but her name was Khadija. She was a Qutub Shahi princess who had married one of the Adil Shahs of Bijapur, became a very powerful force in the Bijapur court. In fact, when she got married, the chief power in the court was a Brahmin general called Murari Pandit, and he had a Muslim associate as well. They were the sort of team that controlled the court. This lady came in and she was instrumental in sort of getting rid of these two gentlemen and bringing in a new set of people who in turn negotiated with the Mughals and came to terms with the Mughals and started basically acknowledging Mughal suzerainty. So if the earlier Murari Pandit faction had continued, they may actually have continued fighting the Mughals rather than signing a treaty with the Mughals. And what is more interesting is Khadija went on the Hajj. She went to Mecca at one point in the mid 1650 or something. And at that time, there's this wonderful Dutch record which talks about how she came to the beach because she was actually sailing on a Dutch ship. And she was first very unimpressed by the size of the ship, but then she realized that in the shallow waters of the sea, that area, that sort of vessel was better. And how they had to construct tents all the way from her palanquin to the ship so she could keep parda and then enter this Dutch ship. And the Dutch were very fascinated. They had to put out this huge show to impress her because they realized that she was a major force in the court. Earlier, among the earliest Adil Shahs of Bijapur, the first Adil Shah was married to a Maratha woman. And it wasn't like her brother had been defeated by him, and therefore she was sort of given as a peace offering almost. But she didn't remain some sort of voiceless woman in the court. She was a very powerful person because 2 generations later, when her legitimate grandson proved less than equal to the task of ruling, she was instrumental in having him blinded and thrown aside and replaced with an illegitimate grandson. So this Maratha woman actually, intervened in the succession of her grandchildren and figured out which one she wanted to put on the throne and which one she supported as against the one that she wanted to blind and throw away. So, the women were always there. It's always just a question of men trying to either expunge them, including from art, or men trying to play down their contributions, or men simply getting jealous. And, there's the story of Hyderabad, for example. You have this Mughal ambassador saying that Hyderabad is named after a hardened whore. of the Qutub Shah, because there's this enduring story that it's named after a courtesan, etc., etc. That story you can't really prove, you can't disprove it either. But what's interesting is that they had to sort of vilify that lady because they thought even that was some kind of a challenge, or that was something they couldn't accept. So women were very important, but one thing that looms large is the insecurity of men, and that's not just the Deccan; it's history throughout.
Since we are in Hyderabad, I'd love you to tell us about this Tanashah and the breakfast. That's one of the most fascinating stories in your book, when Aurangzeb has conquered Golconda and Abul Hasan Tanashah is waiting to surrender. Can you just describe
Yeah,
that?
it's such a dramatic scene, right? It's all so dramatic because Golconda was not defeated because the Mughals succeeded in the siege. They didn't manage to break down the walls. It continued for months and months and months. And the thing is, these sieges, when they happened, the person inside the fort, especially a powerful and good fort like Golconda, they would take precautions for them to survive for perhaps a year or two even. Firstly, if you have access to water, that's half the problem solved. The other thing is, it was always possible to bribe people in the enemy camp to allow food to sort of be smuggled in. So there were always channels of movement like that. And even Aurangzeb realized very quickly that bringing this fort down in a physical sense was not going to happen. Finally, it was through bribery that the fort gates were opened one night. So one night, an Afghan commander in the fort, they established contact privately. They managed to, get him to open one of the minor gates. And that's how the few Mughal troops entered, and they managed to take over the fort and take over the other gates and open it up to the Mughal army. Now, if you've been to Golconda, you'll see that it's a hill. Even now, it's not very easy to climb up to the topmost area, which is where the main darbar, etc. were. So it took a while. It took till, it was early in the morning that all this happened. So by the time the army reached the top, there was a difference. People knew, the news had spread that the city had fallen and that it's time for the king to surrender. And so the enduring story goes that and you find this both in Mughal accounts as well as the local accounts, is that the last Sultan was basically seated in full darbar, and as a king, because he was a king, he had not been defeated in a conventional way. So till he was physically taken away, he was still the king. So he was sat in state in his darbar, and when the Mughal general entered with a few troops, he basically welcomed them as though they were just another set of people who had arrived in the court. He asked them if they were well and whether they'd like any food or breakfast or whatever. Asked them to join him in all that. Of course, that didn't happen. They put the symbolic chains around the man's arm, and he was marched to Aurangzeb's tent, where he finally was deposed and taken away to die far away in the northern parts of the Mughal Empire, of the realm, rather than in his ancestral court. And what's interesting is, even now, if you go to the Golconda tombs, you'll find one incomplete tomb. And all the tourists, the guides there will tell you that this was meant to be Tanashah's personal mausoleum that he was designing. Unfortunately, his fate was to die far away and not anywhere near his kingdom. And that's just how it was. Another dynasty fell, and then another dynasty rose to power.
And that, I visited Daulatabad, the fort where he was imprisoned for some time, and then his tomb in Khuldabad, which is a very simple tomb. And,
yes.
It's when you see these things, or maybe the tomb of the last Sultan of Bijapur, which is in the middle of the market. And it's just a simple tomb right in the middle of a park. And, you just begin to wonder, what was it all about? सब ठाट पड़ा रह जाएगा जब लाज चलेगा बंजारा, कि nothing is left. So all this, these power games are just temporary.
That's the one constant you find in history, right? All these kings are constantly trying to stamp their power on the geography. They're building buildings, putting inscriptions, etc. But in the end, it goes away, and your buildings are often forgotten very quickly. Aurangzeb, all the Qutub Shahi tombs during the siege, Aurangzeb used them for his army as a camp. The British did that. The great temple in Tanjore, the Brihadishwara temple, that whole thing was taken over by them as a garrison for was garrisoned by their troops. And it was only after the kingdom was annexed that the British troops left, and the Maharaja of Tanjore was able to sort of purify the temple and restore it to its earlier traditional use. So even temples could be taken over, even tombs could be taken over. Someone like Akbar, when his tomb was ransacked by a Jat army, they completely looted the place. So, even someone as mighty as Akbar, after a few generations, his tomb had to go through the worst sort of experience, which they would never have imagined possible.
And that actually the effect of Gol Gumbaz on one side in Bijapur and this simple grave in the middle of the market, it's the contrast is
Yes.
really, really
Yeah, and the Gumbad is one of the
stark.
biggest domes in the
Huh,
world.
huh, huh.
It's an
It's really
architectural marvel.
stark. Huh, huh,
And then you have this
huh.
marketplace sultan.
Achha, I think we have this question, though it doesn't have any bearing with your book. How Kerala region could adopt matriarchy when patriarchy was popular in Deccan? What made Kerala so unique? If you want to answer it.
So again, I think because it was, so there are sociologists, historians, anthropologists, etc., who basically say that matrilineal or matriarchy was much more common generally in a certain ancestral pre historical sort of period. And then after land rights start evolving, after human beings start settling down, after property rights become a factor, that's where you slowly start seeing a shift to patriarchy. Kerala, however, as I said, was cut off to begin with from a lot of other regions. The other thing was also Kerala's martial culture was a slightly different one, where you have all these men going off to this Kalaripayattu system when they're still children, and then they train in that system. You have the system of chavers or suicide squads that sort of vow to fight till death, and they can take years, but they will still do it. That sort of thing. The famous Mamangam, festival that used to happen on the banks of the Bharatapura river in Tirunavaya. Every 12 years when it happened, there was a particular Raja who sent assassins to kill the Zamorin of Calicut, and these men would not return. Their duty was to either kill the Zamorin or die in the process. So, in a martial culture like that, I think it was wiser for women to just stay on in their own homes. It gave women the right to have multiple husbands if necessary. Widowhood was not treated as a concept. But I think these later rationalizations of war, etc., may not be the full answer. I think it probably goes back to a tribal root. The tribes that were there were matrilineal because even when the first Brahmins migrated to Kerala, you find that there's one set of Nambudri Brahmins who also adopted matrilineal. They also became matrilineal. They were later downgraded a little bit, and the later Nambudris all became patriarchal, the Brahmins. But the very fact that even the first immigrant Brahmins had to accept matrilineal shows that that was the dominant tribal ethic and tribal code there. And it's just that, through trade, as a society sort of evolved and became a very wealthy society, they sort of, had something to show for that, but equally they didn't give up. They had no reason to give up their matrilineal culture. And, things survived as a result of that.
Let me just tell everybody, we've got 2 minutes left, but we'll come back. You are free, Manu, to come back, isn't it? You have another... within a minute, this session will be cut off because Instagram only allows
sure.
1 hour at a time. So I'll go back.
Is this recorded? Will you post this on your profile or something?
Yes, I'll post it on IGTV as well as put it on my YouTube channel also. So this will be there, and we'll be back for the next session. And just one last question because we have a minute left. Have you what was the effect of Bandanawaz Gesu Daraz on the Gulbarga or the
they were
Bahmani
very close. They were very close. Even in Ibrahim, Adil Shah II's Kitab-e-Norras, he first begins with an invocation to Saraswati, but the second line is Prophet Muhammad and Gizu Daraz. Because again, Sufis were not randomly just out of spiritual devotion. They were also legitimizing aspects. So prominent Sufi is always important to legitimize a king. And if a prominent Sufi and his successors don't give you their stamp of approval, it can be a major crisis in terms of legitimacy. Gizu Daraz is one of the most prominent figures in the Deccan kingly sultanate culture, and in that sense, remained a very powerful force. I'm not giving a long answer since we're running out.
We've just got 30 seconds left. So, because I remember reading about Gesu Daraz that he was upset with some king. Am I forgetting which one?
Yes.
He was upset with the king and he put the uncle instead. He put up
the brother. It was Ahmad Shah Bahmani. He preferred Ahmad Shah Bahmani to succeed to the throne rather than Firoz Shah Bahmani's son. And there was this, and also he didn't like Firoz Shah because Firoz Shah thought he was not well educated enough. Firoz Shah was this very cosmopolitan sort of polymathic character. So he thought Gizu Daraz was only very basic.
So sorry for this interruption, but that's something we cannot do anything about since Instagram doesn't allow more than an hour. I've sent an invitation. Manu will be back. Hello. Manu,
Hi, hi.
we've never had this kind of viewership. There were 1,500 people just now. That's
1500.
1,500.
No, but I thought it showed 150 odd on a, on the
You add a
figure.
zero. You add a zero to it. Whatever the figure
Why?
is given on top, you add a zero. I don't know how it works, but then at the end, when
Oh, okay.
it ends, they give you how many people were watching. So we
How
had
interesting. Good to know.
around, we had around, I think, 1,400 some odd people listening to us, and that's the first for me.
That's very flattering. On a
Yes.
Tuesday evening, it's interesting that people took the time.
So now we'll come back to your question. Till then, my question
Sure.
on another very interesting character in the book, that is Ibrahim Adil Shah.
Hmm. Yeah. He's, one of those. It's so interesting, right? That he is an almost exact contemporary of Akbar. He lives, of course, longer till Jahangir's reign ends. Jahangir and he die in a very short gap after each other. And what's interesting is these men emerge at more or less the same time. I wonder, there are some scholars who talk about a highly syncretic phase which sort of corresponds with Akbar and that that 16th century phase, and how that declines into by the end of the 17th century, and you find increasingly polarized identities, etc. I don't know if it's that, but it's just remarkable that Ibrahim firstly, it was essentially, I see him as the Akbar of the Deccan, because it was a smaller kingdom, but he essentially did the same thing. Where Akbar builds the Fatehpur Sikri, he builds his own Nauraspur. Akbar patronizes, people from different religions, and he has these philosophical debates. You have the same thing with Ibrahim Adil Shah II. Most importantly, of course, Ibrahim goes one step beyond Akbar in venerating Hindu deities. As I said, his Dakhni, one of those early pieces of Dakhni literature, the Kitab-i Nauras that Ibrahim writes, it's got 9, segments to it. It begins not with an invocation to the Prophet Muhammad. Prophet comes second. The first line is Saraswati, because this man was completely obsessed with the goddess Saraswati, to the extent that he wanted to rename Bijapur Vidyapur. And the other god was also Ganapati. He was very interested in Ganapati. And some influence can be traced to his uncle as well, because in his uncle Ali's time, Ali was one of the sultans who defeated Vijayanagar in 1565. But Ali was very close to the Vijayanagar emperor before that. I mean, the de facto emperor Ramaraya and Ali Adil Shah. Ali Adil Shah was adopted as a sort of, foster son to the Vijayanagar ruler, Ramaraya. So it's possible there was that sort of cultural exposure between this Hindu court and that Islamic court, as it were. The other thing is that in Ali's own text, the Nujum al-Ulum, as I said, there's a lot of Hindu influence, there's a lot of tantric influence. It claims to have the only translation of a Sanskrit treatise on Varshik astrology, which you won't really find anywhere else, because what this Varshik astrology is, you only get a glimpse of that in the Nujum. It's got all these artworks that imbibes a lot of Hindu elements into it. So you see that even before Ibrahim, there is this constant sort of interaction between two cultures or two courtly systems in two civilizational spaces. And with Ibrahim, it just gets elevated to a whole new level. He's just, on the one hand, he's just completely fascinating as a character. There's that moment where he's defeated by the Mughals, or he has to come to terms with the Mughals, and he has to send a lot of presents to them, including his favorite elephant, his best gems and jewels, etc., which he reluctantly does. But the one thing he doesn't want to do is to give a daughter to the Mughal harem. But he has no option. It's something that's already been agreed. And when when the ambassador is sent to his court to sort of bring this Adil Shahi bride back with him to the Mughal harem, what Ibrahim does instead is just start bribing this ambassador. So the ambassador sort of vacillates and delays and prevaricates and sits on his job for a good 3-4 years, until Akbar is annoyed in Agra, and Akbar is like Fatehpur Sikri, sorry, and Akbar is like, where the hell is the princess I was supposed to get? Not for him, for his son Daniyal. So Akbar sends a new ambassador with specific instructions not to linger in Bijapur for more than one night. So Ibrahim, again in a very eccentric way, once the ambassador is close enough, it's about 2 weeks distance from Bijapur, Ibrahim sends a messenger saying, no, I'm very busy, I can't receive an ambassador just now, so please halt. So he keeps the ambassador waiting there for a while, bombards him with biryani and dancing girls and conversationalists, and any distraction that he can find, he tries to use to get this ambassador not to come. Once the ambassador comes, he tries to get the ambassador to stay and not leave on time. But the ambassador says, no, my Badshah has given me very clear instructions. I can't stay here for more than one night. So he leaves. But before he leaves, the Din-e-Ilahi of Akbar, that special club of Akbar and his disciples, as it were, they had a special badge that they used to wear. So Ibrahim said, "Oh, what is this wonderful thing? Show it to me. I want to look at it," and so on. Except Ibrahim takes it and takes it away. The ambassador can't go back to the Mughal court without this token which the emperor has given. So he's stuck between the rock and the hard place, because he has to leave Bijapur after one night, but his valuable possession is with the Adil Shah, who won't return it. And the Adil Shah says, no, now I'm a part of the Din-e-Ilahi, I want to keep it, and so on. So another few weeks pass in negotiations. Then the Adil Shah's daughter decides to run away from the Mughal camp and try and come back to Bijapur. Obviously, she didn't do it on her own. Her father must have tried to give her some help in doing that. In the end, all this failed. So there's a sense of human eccentricity that you really see in Ibrahim Adil Shah II. There is that sense of the meeting of two cultures and his awareness of the value that different cultures all have, and how he wants to celebrate all these values. The music, he also has a Renaissance era mannerist painter from Europe who comes and serves in his court, Cornelis Heda. And the thing is, Heda is also spying for the Dutch against the Portuguese. He's also not just an artist. He's trying to, mess up the Portuguese prospects and the Portuguese relationship with Bijapur by getting very close to the Adil Shah. And the Adil Shah flatters him, gives him lots of valuable gifts, etc. But to think that there was a European painter at that time in the Bijapur court, it's just like, in Akbar's court, the Portuguese would send, with the Jesuits, a number of European artists. The patterns are very similar between the two courts. So he was quite remarkable, extremely interesting as a figure, very colorful. And that is why, he was able to sort of take Bijapur to its heights of glory. Even though the Mughals had started to sort of apply pressure, his reign was the peak of Bijapur's prosperity. It was the peak of construction activity in Bijapur. A whole new city was founded. And, there's this one scene where a merchant comes to meet him, and there's this great performance happening. And he's got 500 women playing the veena. Veena is, again, that traditional quintessential South Indian instrument. And he's got 500 of these experts wearing jewelry, etc., sitting there and playing for him. And the city is, very visually, it's clearly a very opulent, prosperous city. And of course, in the early modern times, showing off your wealth and glamour in that sense is always tricky, because your enemies will hear of it and they'll want it. Which is why when the Mughals finally did bring Ibrahim to the negotiating table, they knew exactly what valuables he had, exactly what famous diamonds he had, and they wanted all those for themselves. They knew his favorite elephants; they wanted that for themselves. So yeah, he's a remarkable figure.
He's the one who used to use red nail paint, isn't it?
Yeah, you have some paintings, miniature paintings where he's wearing this sort of nail polish and all that. Yeah.
Because I remember that was when your book had just come out, that I think some article came out with this headline, that the Sultan who wore red nail polish. There's one question. Please throw some light on the instances when the Rayas and the Sultans pitched in to save each other's kingdom from falling apart to internal feuds. How did they act as mediators in such cases?
In fact, that's interesting, again, because in that usual binary of Vijayanagar equal to Hindu and against these Muslim sultans because they were Muslim, the one thing we find is that the Muslim sultans finally come together to attack Vijayanagar because they realize Vijayanagar's been playing one against the other. So at one moment, Vijayanagar will back one sultan and help him against another. At another moment, he'll switch, Ramaraya of Vijayanagar will switch and go over to the other sultan against the one he was earlier championing. And the sultans realized that while they were caught up in their own scramble like this, his power was increasing. Ramaraya's power was growing. At one point, he attacks his chief enemy is the Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar. And this is a very, very serious hatred that the two have. In fact, there's a work of literature in which we hear that Ramaraya insults the Nizam Shah by sending this very sort of random demand for tribute. It's a way of provoking war by saying, oh, I treat you as a vassal, you must send me tribute. And the tribute must include your wife Kunza Humayun's anklets. This is, of course, an exaggeration. But the idea is it's trying to show that Ramaraya had got that arrogant, that he was, his relationship with Ahmednagar was that bad. And what's interesting is when that happened, but before Ramaraya attacked the Ahmednagar kingdom, he actually informed the others. You find the same with Krishnadevaraya, as Srinivas Reddy mentions in his book, that Krishnadevaraya always informed the other sultanates that he was going to attack Sultanate A, so that Sultanate B and C would not panic and think that it was something against them. And they would often say, go ahead, not a problem. You're doing our work for us, that kind of a thing. So you find that there's a lot of give and take like this. the sultans often, come into Vijayanagar as well. You find one of the Qutub Shahs of Golconda, when he was a young boy, his brother came to the throne, murdered another brother. So the only surviving youngest decided to flee. And he didn't flee into one of the other sultanates because they were all relations because of intermarriage. He chose to flee to Vijayanagar because he felt safest in Vijayanagar. And he lived there for a full 7 years. So Vijayanagar gave refuge to a prince in exile here. As I said, Vijayanagar, Ramaraya also adopted, as it were, the Adil Shah of Bijapur as their own. Hey, Ramaraya and Ramaraya's wife said that you're, equal to our son that we've lost. So, there's a lot of overlap like that and intercourse between these different kingdoms. And it again wasn't a black and white aspect. There was a lot of give and take. There were lots of military alliances, and there was plenty for them to chew on. Till, of course, that final moment when the sultans all band together and realize that Vijayanagar is becoming too powerful and needs to be cut down to size. That's why they don't annex Vijayanagar. They don't take over Vijayanagar. They defeat Vijayanagar, but the Vijayanagar Empire continues. They merely put Vijayanagar in its place. And say that you're just cutting down your excessive power to restore the balance of power that was there before.
That's a very interesting point. There's one question: how did Adil Shah lose Goa to the Portuguese? Please shed light on that.
So this was originally Vijayanagar territory. It was then the famous Bahmani Sultan's minister Mahmud Gawan is the one who sort of picks it up for the Bahmani Sultans. Later, it falls into the hands of the Adil Shahs, when the Bahmani Empire sort of collapses soon after Gawan. And the first of the Adil Shahs is one of Mahmud Gawan's proteges. So he's the one who ends up with Goa and his share of the ex-Bahmani Empire. But then again, the Portuguese are strong. And Goa, as we know it today, the state of Goa, it wasn't actually that large. Much of this was actually added by the Portuguese in a much later period, even as late as the 18th century. So when we're talking about that period, it's still 1 or 2 islands. It's not really more than that. But the Portuguese had the strength of arms. They were able to defeat the Adil Shah's army. The Adil Shah managed to briefly, return to control of those particular islands, but they were again pushed out of that. And once the Portuguese managed to fortify that place and settle down, then it was difficult to move them out because they had better guns. They had, you find this with South Indian kings. They realized that fighting these people at sea is not easy. So it's better to sort of, keep them inside there. Shivaji's famous Ajna Patra, not Shivaji, but one of his courtiers later wrote it. And the Ajna Patra talks about this, about how foreign merchants, if you're ever doing business with them and giving them land to settle, never ever let them settle by the sea. Bring them in at least 8 or 18 miles inland. Make sure that it's an open plain, not a hilly territory, and give them a spot to settle there because that's the only way you can control them. So Indian kings very quickly started to become aware that giving European powers this sort of coastal enclaves that they had was a very risky thing because once you fortified it with the guns that these foreigners had, there was no way you could challenge them.
There's one question which has been asked by a number of people, and even I want to ask you, and I think I've asked you also. They're asking, how do you remember everything and what you got you so interested in history? So that's something I've asked Manu also a number of times. How do you remember all this?
Well, this is now my job, right? This is what I do. So one has to be good at one's job. You can't not remember what you've written or not remember what you're working on, because that would be extremely embarrassing. In fact, there was this one clipping from a thing I did a couple of years ago. It was an actual event, and they recorded it. And one snippet of that was cut out, and it was going around on WhatsApp, etc. And I was mortified to discover that while I was speaking there, I was speaking very fast. I have a tendency to speak very fast once I get excited about what I'm saying. And what was interesting was that there was this one line about how I was talking about the famous Kshetraya, who composed a lot of Bhakti poetry, and how Kshetraya not only got patronage in Madurai and the big Hindu courts, but also in the court of the Qutub Shah of Golconda, for whom he composed 1,500 padams. Except in my speed, I ended up saying not 1,500, but 105,000 padams. So there are slips like that happen sometimes, simply because of my enthusiasm and pace of speech. But
I think that
otherwise,
also youth on your side. Because I don't hardly remember anything. I used to, but now for me it's very difficult to remember everything that I write.
No, you're very good at remembering. Everyone has their pet topics, right? Everyone has the things. Anything on Delhi, I'm pretty sure you would come up with like that, because that's your pet space. You know that inside out. So it's the same thing, there are certain subjects which really make an impact on your mind. My first book, I spent 6 years writing it. So it's almost like somewhere it's sort of inscribed on my brain, all the
and you were very
information from
young
that
when
book.
you started. You were just 19 when you started writing.
Yeah, so memory was also better.
You're still very good. Acha, there's this question again. This fascinated me in your book, I remember. Can you talk a bit about one of the uncles of Adil Shah whose successors converted to Christianity? Did this have a
Yeah.
political motive, or what was this about?
That particular case did not have a political motive because it was not the uncle who converted, it was the uncle's daughter and then subsequently other male descendants as well. Because what happened was, and remember, this was not all that unusual because if you recall, even in the Mughal court, Jahangir got some of his nephews converted to Christianity very briefly. What is interesting is that he got Prince Danial, his brother Prince Danial's. Danial, by the way, is the one who married the Bijapur princess. So, it's interesting. I wonder if these sons were somehow the children of that Bijapur princess. Unlikely, but anyway. So, Danial's sons were converted by Jahangir to the Catholic faith. So, the Jesuits never managed to convert the emperor, but they managed to convert the emperor's nephews, 3 of them, or 4 of them. Yeah, 4 nephews altogether, I think. And what is interesting is that after a few years, they lapsed back to Islam. But what the timing is interesting. They lapsed back at a time when the Portuguese relationship with the Mughals had got into choppy water because the Portuguese had attacked Jahangir's mother's ship. Jahangir was basically paying them back and saying, no more business with you guys. Get out of my court. Jesuits were also out of favor. So it corresponds with that. But another interesting account that we also have, which I think is from an ambassador, who talks about how Jahangir, in converting his nephews, not only was he on one level removing them from the line of succession, because once you become Catholics, you can't succeed to the throne. So that was it was to his advantage to convert these potential claimants, where later Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, etc., would kill. Here, Jahangir found a much more peaceful process of putting them aside as Christians. But the thing is, he apparently wanted these men to find brides suitable to their imperial princely status. So they were Catholics, but they were still Muslim Mughal princes. So he basically expected the Portuguese to supply Catholic princesses from Europe, which of course was not coming. And that apparently was another reason why Jahangir basically encouraged these people to move back to Islam. And the idea of a marriage with the Portuguese is not all that alarming or all that unusual, because you find a Vijayanagar emperor also made the same proposal to King Manuel of Portugal, where he said, I will send you one of my daughters, you send me one of your sisters or daughters, and I will rule the land, and through the Portuguese company and the traders, you can rule the sea, and we'll have this sort of power equation between us. The very fact that Vijayanagar considered it, but of course the Catholic king in Portugal was horrified at the idea of sending a daughter out to a pagan country, to an idolater. So that never happened. The Goa incident is where one of these uncles is a contender for the throne. He first removes himself from contention, gets on a ship to Mecca, which was that standard thing. Every time there was a rival to an emperor or someone the emperor didn't like, he used to send them on the Hajj to basically go off to Mecca and spend the rest of their days in exile. That's what Akbar did, for example, to his regent. Of course, the regent was killed on the way and never actually made it to Mecca. So, like this uncle was sent off on Mecca, except that because of storms at sea, etc., his ship basically washed up in Gujarat. There in Surat, the Portuguese said, no, look, we will support you, we'll give you backing, we will help you regain your place in the family. So there this intriguing starts, and slowly this Mia Ali, that's what he's called, he moves away to Goa. Except that having brought him there, on the one hand, his nephew is trying to bribe the Portuguese to return the man, saying, I'll pay you so much, you send my uncle back to me. And the uncle is horrified because the uncle will lose his head the moment he gets back to Bijapur. So the uncle saying, no, Portuguese must support him. The Portuguese ship him off to Malabar at one point, bring him back. They set out with an army, complete flop of a military encounter. Very quickly, not very quickly actually, in about 15 years, they realize this Mia Ali's prospects are doomed. He's never going to become the Adil Shah. The Adil Shah is too powerful. And Mia Ali, by the way, was trying to get his daughter married to the Vijayanagar emperor, if the Vijayanagar emperor would help him claim the throne of Bijapur. So again, you see political alliances between these kingdoms, each helping the other in their time of need. That didn't work out. This daughter, it turns out, had become very close to a Catholic lady in Goa, one of their neighbors or something. And she decided that she wanted to convert. She wanted to become a Catholic. And one fine morning, the entire Goan establishment, right down from the viceroy, with the governor, they all show up in Miali's house, and this gentleman is a little taken aback that they've all come there on a Sunday. And there's a physical altercation where the mother of the girl and her female relations are talking at one end, the Christian women are talking at the other end, and an account from one of these Christian fathers talks about how all their hair came undone because there was such a tussle there. But eventually, the Portuguese take the girl away. She converts. She marries one of these Christian men there, and she births a line of men, and they're all called Milis or Mila. I don't know how you pronounce it exactly, but it's basically a corruption of Mia Ali, her poor father's name. And you find that even decades later, there are still descendants of that Christian branch of the Adil Shahi family in Goa. I wonder if their descendants are still there. I'm sure they're scattered somewhere in Goa, but it would be interesting to trace them.
That is something I think we should ask Vivek, whether Vivek can, I'm sure, trace them down.
I've already sent Vivek Menzies another request, which was that Raja Ravi Verma, the painter, had a son. And the older son, he disappeared in 1912. He was a drunkard and all that. So the story goes, he came to Goa, converted to the Christian faith, and married a Konkani Christian lady and had children in Goa. But no one's ever found these Christian descendants of Raja Ravi Verma. So I've already saddled Vivek with one investigative matter.
There's this question from Anil Kumar. What is the one lesson current India can learn from Deccan's history?
I think we need to treat history with a certain amount of maturity, and we need to look at it with a certain amount of sobriety. This getting carried away with history and trying to fight battles of 500 years ago in the present. Even our present is not that valuable. I mean, that's the one thing you learn with history, right? All these kings thought they were doing earth-shattering things and that they were going to leave their marks here forever. Most of them we don't even remember. Some we remember. For every one king or one historical glamorous figure that we remember today, there are at least 100 who we don't even know anything about, who belong to a period that we've completely forgotten about. Ashoka was forgotten about till the British Orientalists basically resurrected him and said, hold on, you guys have this great emperor. Rajaraja Chola, in only 800 years, he was forgotten about. People knew of the Cholas, but they had forgotten his name. They had forgotten who he was. Till, of course, the British again resurrected that particular name. So we also need to calm down a little bit and realize that, we can afford to be calmer, we can afford to be more sober, and we can deal with current day problems in a mature way, rather than this my way or the highway, some sort of civilizational battle. It's never a civilizational battle. Time keeps spinning, the world keeps spinning. And I think having that sense of humility that we've only got a limited number of years here, we might as well use it productively and leave something better for the future to remember us by as a society. That we're not doing. In our quest to fight with each other, we're all leaving ugly buildings and mountains of plastic, whereas at least even 50, 60 years ago, our ancestors left something far more tangible to remember them by, whereas we seem not to be up to that task, which is sad.
Especially with the coronavirus and this COVID-19 situation, this is the time to step back and rethink life. At least I've been thinking about that. There's so many other things, like life, being safe, there's so many things to be worried about apart from just religion and, what happened 1,000 years ago. Do you think owing to the more intimate contact with foreigners, Deccan was militarily advanced than the rest of India?
Well, we can't say about the rest of India, because even the Mughals, using the land route, they managed to get a lot of military talent from the Persian world and even Eastern Europe. A lot of the artillery men came from the Ottoman Empire, Eastern Europe, Hungary, and places like that. So even the Mughals managed to do that. But what's interesting is that Vijayanagar, on a corresponding level, does not technologically upgrade itself. You find this interesting thing where both Vijayanagar and the Deccan Sultans have access to the same sort of trading networks and same horse suppliers and so on. But for some reason, Vijayanagar's fortifications don't improve. Their use of artillery and increasing gunpowder technology does not improve. And it may partly be because the sultans were part of that Islamic network, that Persianate network, a Persian-speaking network that connected a very vast section of the globe. As I said, from the Ottoman Empire, even all the way to Thailand and parts of Southeast Asia, Persian at one point was very dominant in these parts also. They were able to draw in talent, human talent, which Vijayanagar could not. Vijayanagar could bring in substance, the material, they could bring in the goods, but they could not bring in the human manpower. Whereas the sultans of the Deccan had the advantage of bringing in Iraqis, Iranians, Africans, people from the Ottoman Empire, all over the Islamic world because that common network existed and it was a very powerful network. So the technological advances that the Deccan Sultans had, you find that Hindu Vijayanagar, for some reason, or well, for these reasons, did not manage to catch up.
Another question is from Palak. Can you please elaborate on the relation between the water systems in Iran and the systems in Bijapur, Bidar, Ahmednagar, etc.?
I mean, the Bijapur has its own system. You find in the city that Malik Ambar set up, which we now call Aurangabad. It was originally called Khirki. That also has the same system. There's no direct trace that you can make between these two places, but because a lot of general architectural styles were imported from the Persian world, it's very likely that the same system also supplied engineers who helped design these tunnels, who helped design these underground water systems that you find in Bijapur as well as in the new Nizam Shahi capital that was later called Aurangabad. So I'm assuming it's the same technicians, the same people who brought this in from there as well.
Can you both share the difference between the Iqta system of Delhi and the Amar Naika system of Vijayanagar, as both are quite similar?
There are similarities, but there are differences also. The way who's written well about this. I recently remember reading, is it Burton Stein? Someone has written in considerable detail about the land parceling and how it was divided with the nobility, etc. There are minor differences because I think even in the Vijayanagar system, again, it's geography. I think south of the river, the fertility of the land, I think, is less as compared to north of the river in the areas that the sultans commanded. So you have slightly different land structures there. But I'm not a master on this, so I won't really say more about this. But there are studies about this. I can't remember the names of the scholars.
We'll put it on the post whenever if you can remember it. Just let me know. I'll put it on the same post. Talking about conversions, you speak about how the Calicut Zamorin insisted that every trade family have a Muslim son to deal with the Arab traders. Could you please tell us more about that?
This appears in this one interesting place where he doesn't talk about traders' sons, he talks about fisher folk. Every fishing family had to raise one son as a Muslim. At least one Zamorin seems to have issued orders to this effect. It's not surprising, partly because that whole coastal trade system was dominated by Arabs. It was dominated by Arabian networks, and they often came here, married local women, and created what later we call the Mapla community. That was a community that was part Arab, part Malayali. So I suppose as part of that, and if you look later also, the Zamorins' navy, it was manned by Muslims. The Kunyali Marakkars, they were all Muslims. Because there was this association of Muslims with seafaring, with trade, especially in coastal societies. Muslims in Kerala were not a formidable land force in the sense that they didn't, with one exception, the Lakshadweep islands controlled by the Arakkal family, there were no Muslim kings. Muslims were not a political power till Tipu Sultan's invasion took place. They were, however, given their particular zone or their particular area, which was trade. And I suppose this one Zamorin decided that he needed more people on his navy. He wanted to develop a greater naval force because the Portuguese and all these other people were coming into the game. And for that reason, his natural instinct seems to have been to create more Muslims rather than handing it over to any new Hindu groups, because Hindu groups were land oriented. They were not going to go out and sail.
Professor Rizavi is saying that the princess conversion story is not supported by Mughal records. And,
yeah, possible. It appears, I think, in that Tufat-i-Mujahideen. I think that's where it appears. But again, as I said, it's only one Zamorin and one story. So we can't categorically say that this was some kind of long-standing policy. But even if it was mentioned just as an exaggeration, the very fact that it was mentioned is probably an effort to show how welcoming the Zamorin was of Muslims and Muslim culture and so on.
Often I think this is in reference to that other story about the Bijapur girl who converted to Christianity.
No, it doesn't appear in Mughals. Yeah, it appears only in that one in a Portuguese Jesuits account. But Sanjay Subramaniam does mention, as I said, decades later, people by that name, by that surname, which these people are supposed to have taken. That surname, that keeps appearing in a later period. So Sanjay Subramaniam finds that in the later records of the Goan authorities as well. So decades after this happened, someone also has specific names of these men. Dom XYZ Meali. There's that. There are 3 or 4 men like that named with that surname. So that family seems to have existed.
Apparently, Persian influence are strong in Burhanpur. Of course, Panchakki was Malik Akbar's creation. There was this one question which I'm just trying to go back and see where it is. You have discussed about the diamonds that were produced in Golconda. What happened to the mines thereafter?
I think the mines basically fell, as in they stopped working right after a while. I'm not entirely sure what happened. In the late 17th century, they were still active. By the 18th century, I think diamonds started coming in from other places as well. To begin with, there was competition. I think at one point, Golconda dominated, as in Indian mines dominated the whole diamond production in much of the world, because this was the one place where it was being regularly done. But I think the mines seem to have run out, or something's happened, because now we don't hear much of Golconda diamonds. Golconda diamonds are always spoken of in past tense. They're not considered a present day thing. So it's in a historical context that we speak of Golconda diamonds. But again, you'll have to check with the jewelry historian. Someone like Usha Balakrishnan may know what the current fate of the diamond mines are. I only know what happened in the 17th century.
Paul has asked a question which I haven't understood. Chirakal BVs. Can you please re-ask this question, retype this question, Paul? Because there must be something before that which I have missed. There's so many questions actually that it is. Jahangir's nephews is discussed by Munis Farooqi in his book. He talks about nephews being converted.
Yeah, several places. There's also a writer called a scholar called George Flores, I think, who's translated a Jesuit text on the Mughal court from about 1610. I think he also refers to this. That text also refers to these 3 nephews.
Could you add a note on the evolution of Arakkal kingdom? I haven't even heard of this.
Arakkal is that Muslim royal family, the only Muslim royal family in Kerala. Now, of course, there's the historical side and there's the legendary side. The enduring romantic story is that one day a Kolatri princess, Kolatris were the North Kerala, North Malabar rulers. She'd gone out for a bath or something and she was drowning. And a brave Muslim who happened to be passing by jumped into the river or into the well or to the pond or wherever she was, and went out to save her. Except that she had lost her clothes obviously in the process of drowning. So when she was rescued and she was still in the water, he handed over a munda. Munda is the thing we tie around the waist and loosely throw over the torso. But the thing is, among the matrilineal castes, giving the munda is the marriage rite. That is the chief ritual in any marriage. So once she accepted the munda, she said, look, now you're my husband, so I can't go back to the palace. You have to accept me. This is the story. Historians, however, find that it was probably a very prominent Nair family who were ministers to the Kolatiri Rajas. They were the ones who converted to Islam. And they became the Rajas of Arakkal. Which is why, despite everything in the Sharia and everything as far as Quranic precepts go, the Arakkal family retained its matrilineal tradition. Retained a matrilineal tradition that is not seen in Hindu matrilineal families, which is in Hindu matrilineal families, although succession is in the female line, it's the eldest male who actually succeeds. Arakkal has this one difference, which is that women succeed in their own right. So if a girl and a boy are born, if the girl is born first, she gets to rule as the Ali Raja. And it's when she dies that her husband becomes the next Ali Raja. The women have this additional title of Bibi. So, Jumaname Bibi Ali Raja. That's how you will call the women. And the men will just be called Ali Raja. But the woman has the right, she has precedence over male members if she's born before. So the Arakkal family is a Muslim royal family. It's matrilineal, and it has this one twist in its matrilineal, which is that women can rule in their own right. And they, of course, controlled the Lakshadweep Islands for a very long time. Just before Tipu's time, they lost control of half the islands. The islands revolted and went over to Tipu Sultan's side. After that, the British allowed them to retain some of the islands, but through the 19th century, their control over those islands also depleted because they were not very good rulers. They used to sort of exploit these islands in a very bad way. And their agents used to exploit the islanders as well, because they lived in the mainland. They lived in mainland Kerala. The islands were separated, and not a single ruler actually went to Lakshadweep. It was always a different zone for them for their commercial gains. So then finally, in the early part of the 20th century, at some point, they officially de-recognized their claims over it, accepted a pension from the British government, and that pension is still paid. So even today, the government of India recognizes a male and female head of the Arakel family, and they still have their titles, and they still get that token pension of some 22,000 rupees or something like that on a yearly basis.
And they live in Cochin.
No, so this is actually north of Cochin. It's closer to Calicut.
Okay.
Their palace is now a museum, but the family is scattered all over the place. It's not it's a very large family now. It's not like there's one set of people living there. There are some who manage a museum, etc., but primarily it's a museum and a relic of the past.
Because this is the area I've lived in for 3 years, but that was years ago. I think 30 odd years ago that I lived in Cochin and Calicut. Now, again, my phone battery will be running out soon. So I want one question, and this is not to you as a historian, it's to you as a person. Who is your favorite character in the Deccan? In amongst all the kings and queens that you've written about, who is your favorite character?
It's very difficult to choose because, as I said, Ibrahim Adil Shah is this immensely charismatic figure. I would love to have met this kind of man, this colorful, vibrant sort of figure. But equally in terms, but Ibrahim at one level inherited his position. He did a good job with it, but he was given everything on a golden platter. So I'll take that much away from him. The other person is Malik Ambar. He came out of nowhere. He came out of nowhere and became a kingmaker. He came out of nowhere from slavery to becoming a general soldier, to becoming a minor warlord with 300 African troops, to becoming a man who had 5,000, then 7,000, then 20,000, gets the Marathas to back him and creates this huge enterprise and keeps something as powerful as the Mughal Empire at bay for a good 25 years. That to me is the real rags to riches story in the Deccan. And to just visualize it, you shut your eyes and you visualize what is now a tier 3 town like Ahmednagar or that general area in Maharashtra, and you think of an African warlord with his Maratha fighters and a half Persian, half Hindu dynasty represented by Ibrahim Adil Shah, these women like Chand Bibi, the fact that Ahmednagar had 2 black begums, including Malik Ambar's daughter who married one of the sultans. There were black queens in a place like Ahmednagar. Just shut your eyes and try to visualize that. That world is just remarkable. We were never taught about it in a sense. We never taught to visualize this kind of diversity in costume, in culture, in color of the skin, in the kind of religions that were practiced. It's so remarkable. So Malik Ambar, I think, would be the person I would call perhaps my favorite, even though Ibrahim is very charismatic, and I'm tempted to enthrone him as the favorite, but I think it's really Malik Ambar because he's, in terms of achievement, he really came out of nowhere and did something phenomenal.
There's this question from Pavitra. You never answered what got you interested in history.
Oh, this is a standard question I get these days, and I'm starting to feel my answers becoming a little stale because it's the same answer all the time, which is that it was the stories I heard in Kerala about my own ancestors to begin with, because we had this rather dull and boring school life in Pune, and then you'd go to Kerala where we had this ancestral place in the village and these groves with their Yakshi stories and serpent gods and 2 fighting goddesses and things like that, and a matrilineal system that was never taught in my school textbooks. And a great grandmother who flung a log of fire at the tax collector's elephant, another one who was his Sanskrit scholar, and there's this tragic romance with the Brahmin, all kinds of vivid stories. And because I had a grandmother who never censored anything, she always told things as they were, I was able to flesh out, when you think, say, great-grandmother, great-great-grandfather, often these are concepts in our mind. We expect grandparents to behave a certain way and take away their humanity from them. Whereas when you hear their stories as they were, without censorship, about the naughty things they did, about the illegitimate children they fathered in different places, things like that, you realize that, hold on, they were just human beings. They did all kinds of naughty and ridiculous things that people do even now. And that, for me, humanized these figures. That then became a larger interest in the history of that region, which became a history in an interest in larger principality in which they worked. And finally, an interest in Kerala history, and then I zoomed out into the Deccan and other places, and that's how it all happened.
So we'll take one last question because I've got just 20% left according to the notification. Somebody saying Jahangir is not going to like you.
Well,
Like
there are lots of people who like Jahangir, lots of people who work on the Mughals. I don't mind if Jahangir doesn't like me, so long as my Deccan Sultans like me.
and you know, this sense of Malik Akbar that you talked when I went to his grave, it was such a
A
powerful
very
and
charming structure.
dignified, very charming, and such
Yeah.
a sense of power and dignity in that. You know, the same kind
Yeah.
of dignity and power that you see in the portraits of him. It's the same kind of thing that you
Yeah.
get over there, although it's
Yeah,
badly
it's there's an
neglected.
austerity to it. It's
Yes,
not
yes.
overdone. It's not over
Ha ha
ornamented,
ha ha
but
ha ha
equally it's very charming. It's very impressive, and
ha
it sort of encapsulates the man. It sort of
ha
encapsulates
ha.
what he was like,
A
to
lot
the
of
point, crisp,
ha
achieved things, and that's it.
ha
Like,
ha
move on
ha
from there.
ha
There's no
ha ha
embellishment and
ha.
excessive drama and
ha.
flashiness to it.
So thanks a lot, Manu. We've had lots of fun,
Thank you, Rana.
and it's always a pleasure talking to you. And
No,
maybe
and
meet
likewise,
soon.
wonderful talking to you,
Uh-huh.
and I'm
Maybe
glad to have mined out so much history after a long time.
yes,
And yeah, do post this online, and I'll
yes,
share
yes.
it on my feed
Ha,
as
ha,
well.
ha. I've just done that. And what was the one book that has inspired you to be a writer? I think this will be the last question
No,
because
no,
my battery is
there's no such book. There's no
okay.
such book. There are
Okay.
many, many books. I never name a single book. And that's the thing with books. Once you read a good book, you find another, and then it's a rabbit hole. There's no end to it. So I can never name a favorite book. It's many, 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 many favorite books in different ways.
So I'll just tag you on that on my IGTV post, and all of those who have been watching, if these posts will be on IGTV, you can go and see it there, and I'll be posting it on the YouTube channel also. So thank you,
And
Manu,
thank you for
and it's
watching.
been
Thank
wonderful.
you.
And thank you
Thank you.
everybody who
Thanks a lot.
came. I'll just post the figures. I think again it's 1,000 something that people have come.
Wow.
So bye
Thanks. And
bye and
everyone stay
thank you.
safe and read
Stay
books
safe.
in this
Yes,
age of
yes.
Corona.
And as Manu said, be calm. Don't get
Yes.
too excited about everything, and it's not worth it. Life is
Yeah.
far more precious.
And there's too much to do and too little time.
So bye bye. Thank you, and all the
Bye,
best.
Rana. See you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.